Cast your mind back to 2007. You've worked your ass off for the last month doing overtime, or perhaps the latest chunk of your student loan has just landed in your bank account, and finally, after 5 years of low settings and pain, you decide to purchase a new PC. You're feeling pretty good right now, 200 frames per second in Counter-Strike Source, you can actually run the Elder Scrolls Oblivion on high preset at 1680 by 1050 resolution, rocking an Intel Core 2 Duo E6600 with an Nvidia 8800 Ultra. Whew, feel the power and the heat. The question is though, can it run Crysis? Damn, probably not. That was the meme back then. In fact, the meme is still around today to a certain extent, more of a joke now, but no matter how good your PC was or how powerful, the question was always, could it run Crysis? And unless your PC was pretty hefty, the answer was no. The original Crysis released in November 2007, and when it did, it set the benchmark for visuals at the time in a video game. I'm still not sure that any video game since has come close to creating such a massive gap in graphics compared to its peers at the time since then. Crysis just looks so much better than anything else on the market for the next couple of years. The only ones I could think of really historically, perhaps something like the Frostbite engine when Battlefront gameplay was revealed, and more recently something like Uncharted 4. But back then, this was such a leap in visual quality that everyone stood up and took notice. It was a big deal. I remember playing through one of the later levels when you're in zero gravity, floating through an alien spaceship. It was probably running at 25 frames per second, but it looked like I was playing a CGI movie back then. I was just blown away. The game was made by Crytek and was based on one of the first versions of their engine, the Cry engine, an iteration of which also powered the very first Far Cry game 3 years earlier. Of course, Far Cry is now owned by Ubisoft, but it was Crytek who made the original. Interestingly, EA were also publishers of the original Crysis, the more you know. When it released, it was one of the very first games to use DirectX 10, and back then, that was a big deal. It even required Windows Vista or greater. Ugh, remember Windows Vista? I sadly do. I think the only reason I bought it though was to play Halo 2 on PC. I digress. As we all know, right now some games are using DirectX 12, some still DirectX 11. There was a guy called Roy Taylor who worked for Nvidia at the time, and he claimed that Crysis uses over 85,000 shaders. Essentially, these are like little programs that calculate rendering effects. In today's game design, shaders are very common, but back then using so many was simply unheard of. It was also the first game to ever implement screen space ambient occlusion, which is an effect for efficiently approximating the ambient occlusion effect in real time. Sounds confusing, well it is, but you've probably seen the abbreviation SSAO in the options menu on various PC games. It was developed by Vladimir Kajalin when he was working at Crytek, and so Crysis was one of the first ever games to use it. It makes the lighting and shadows look just a little more realistic, especially when inside buildings. Crysis even had incredible destruction and physics, the likes of which you don't even see in some games today. Entire shacks could be destroyed and each individual part would move separately. Hell, you could even punch walls down with your nanosuit. Now of course these are only flimsy shacks, so their destruction is not exactly the same as having destruction on a much more formed building in a modern game, but back then this level of contextual destruction was advanced. Even the cars had zone destruction on them too. All of the tyres, for example, could be popped, something that's very common these days in open world games like Far Cry for example. It's funny really, because the other day I released a video on how I thought that Battlefield Heroes was well ahead of its time, and here we are, we've got another example of a game doing the same thing. Crysis was just so far ahead of its time visually that most PCs couldn't handle running it, and if they could, you'd have to tone down the settings massively. The game's design and ideals were just ahead of what the hardware of the time could achieve. In fact, back then when new hardware was released, it was often tested against Crysis to see how it coped. The built-in benchmark test that came with the game brought modern graphics cards to their knees and was used as a reference point for years down the line. The funny thing is though that even on medium settings, the game still looks amazing for its time. The vistas, the vegetation, the turtles, the god rays and the lighting, there's just so much detail in the world, and I think the game still looks good today, but of course it does show its age. But then again, we've been spoilt by some incredible looking games over the past 10 years. But what was the game even about, and was the gameplay good? Why was it so memorable to me? A lot of reviewers at the time passed this off as an expensive tech demo for the CryEngine. But for me, Crysis offered gameplay that we don't get much anymore in single player first person shooters. So the game was set on an island called Lingshan in the North Pacific. And you're a part of Raptor Team, and you happen to be equipped with a badass nanosuit, something that's become quite iconic over the years. The enemies are North Korean soldiers and have taken a group of archaeologists hostage. You've got to get in there, find out what they're up to, and the intro has you skydiving out of a plane, and I remember how awesome that was when I first tried it. Just the scale of it as you're coming down to the land and the moonlight as you flew into the level. Incredible. I think it's fair to say too that the first half of the game is a lot better than the second half, because during the beginning you're fighting your way past enemy soldiers, different camps, patrols, that sort of thing, but during the second half there's, spoiler alert, aliens to deal with, and to a certain extent a lot of your freedom is taken away in the second part of the game. But one of the things Crysis offered you in the first portion of the campaign was freedom. Even in parts where you weren't entirely free to do what you wanted, you still felt like you had choices to make, and while you had this super powerful nanosuit, you had to use it smartly because it didn't just make you invulnerable. You had stealth, armor and speed. Those were your options, as well as a load of guns. And how you completed your objective was up to you, fighting through a big sandbox of toys and awesome visuals. It was one of the first games that I can remember that had in-game real-time weapon customization too, so you could press the customize button, it would bring the gun up and you could change out the sights, the barrel, all sorts of different ways to set up your weapon and character that changed how you wanted to play the game. And Crysis was hard, it was not an easy game. You died, and then you died again, and then you died some more, but it was always fun, mostly. The AI was pretty unforgiving at times too, make a bit too much noise or run out of invisibility and they'll be onto you, although there's nothing quite like grabbing an AI soldier and flinging him around like a toy. Never gets old. The story gets better though. A year after Crysis launched, a standalone expansion was released called Crysis Warhead. Warhead was set on the same island at the same time as the original story, but instead you played as another member of Raptor Team called Psycho, and you're off doing whatever he was doing on the other side of the island. Believe it or not, but Warhead improved the visuals, the performance, the AI, and the overall pacing, and it had mostly positive reviews, although some critics were keen to point out that there wasn't enough there to separate it from the original game. I certainly had a blast with it though, and for me it was always an expansion pack. Moving on, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the multiplayer. So in the original Crysis, up to 32 players were supported in each match, and it utilised the old GameSpy network. You only had two modes available, Instant Action and Power Struggle, each of which had 6 maps. Instant Action was a deathmatch mode, which is self-explanatory, but Power Struggle was a bit interesting, and it had 2 teams facing off with the aim to destroy the enemy team's headquarters. It was on large maps too, and to destroy the HQ you needed to use attack launcher, attack tank, or a singularity tank, and to gain those you needed to control prototype facilities. Only 2 modes is a pretty flimsy offering for multiplayer, but Crytek were to rectify that with Crysis Warhead, and with the release of Warhead came the release of Crysis Wars, and this was a brand new multiplayer package if you will, and trust me when I say I played this loads with my friends at uni, and Crytek had something really special here that never really took off, again well ahead of its time I feel. Crysis Wars was a multiplayer portion of Crysis, but it was actually on a separate disc to Warhead. As such it was deemed a separate game by Crytek and had its own launcher and installer. Even still it came bundled with the game at no extra cost. It included the same 2 game modes from the base game, as well as including Team Instant Action, so Team Deathmatch, and tons of rebalancing, as well as 21 playable maps. Power Struggle though was the gem in the rough. It was amazing. It was kind of like Battlefield Conquest on acid. You had tanks, VTOLs, helicopters, armoured jeeps, rocket launchers, nukes, everyone jumping around in nanosuits. It was a brilliant team-based multiplayer experience that myself and close friends have very fond memories of. And I'd love to see Crytek bring out an updated free-to-play standalone version of that game mode. It would be a blast in 2018 to go back to that, and I think it would be really successful. Moving on, the original Crysis set the tone for the franchise. Tech demo, game, whatever you want to call it, it has you on an incredibly lush island with beautiful scenery, with luscious vegetation, and then it allows you to go about certain gameplay situations however you want to, and players love that. Then Warhead releases, which is more of the same with some improvements in the writing and story, and then of course Crysis 2 and Crysis 3 come out later down the line, and you'd think they'd offer more of the same. Sadly not. When Crysis 2 released, I think the franchise lost its way. First up, it's set in New York City. Now the reasoning for that I can understand. I think after releasing Far Cry and then Crysis and its follow-up Warhead on lush islands, the devs probably didn't just want to do that again and repeat the same exact environment. I don't have a problem with that, but sadly the gameplay itself became far more linear and, dare I say, boring. In the original Crysis you had an objective to say go to a certain place, and you had some freedom to decide how you were going to do that. In Crysis 2 though, while you can still make tactical decisions on how you will approach certain enemies, you feel as though you have to take certain linear paths to proceed. The same applies for the third game too. The soundtrack though, man, it was good. Hans Zimmer does not disappoint. Inevitably, games change, they evolve and they go in different directions, and sometimes that's fine. I think a lot of people probably really enjoyed Crysis 2 and 3, and I'm not saying that I didn't like them, but the spark of the first game was definitely lost a little bit, at least for me. If you look at Far Cry, I think that's also an interesting example. Crytek made the first Far Cry game, but after that Ubisoft took over. I'd say that while you might not think all of the Far Cry games are great, their open world design has remained very similar, and the latest iteration of the game, Far Cry 5, in terms of fun gameplay, is arguably one of the best in my opinion. I want to see a new Crysis game that blows me away visually, and a game that allows me to do what I want to do. I know that's asking a lot considering we live in an age where we see so many amazing looking games each day, so I think it's going to be much harder to take that next step. Certainly harder than it was 10 years ago. I think ray tracing, from what we've been seeing in the last couple of months, is going to be the way forward and the next big leap in graphical quality. Crysis 3 released in 2013, so now almost 5 years later, and with Crytek focusing on games like Warface, The Hunt Showdown and their CryEngine, will we ever see another AAA Crysis game? I hope so, and I'd love to hear the saying, maximum armor, one day again. And that's all for today guys. Did you play Crysis back in the day, or Crysis Wars? Fond memories or bad memories, let me know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, give me a like, that would be much appreciated, thank you. If you didn't like it, dislike it, subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.